Clinical psychology methodology. Primary and secondary data. Primary data. Primary data are gathered first-hand from source. They are gathered by the researcher. They are for the purpose that they are intended. Milgram 1963 gathered primary data when noting the voltage at which a participant stopped giving a shock to someone. Bandura et al. 1961 gathered primary data when measuring aggressive behavior of children who had watched various examples of aggressive behavior or not. Observations, case studies, questionnaires, interviews, and experiments are all ways of gathering primary data. Secondary data are data that someone has already gathered, which means they are second-hand. They are for the purpose of the researchers who gathered them. They are then used by someone else for the purpose of their own research, which is likely to be different from the original purpose. They can come from government sources, such as statistics of deprivation in an area or information about daycare. A meta-analysis uses secondary data because a meta-analysis is an analysis of many different studies focused on the same hypothesis or area, so it draws on the findings of those different studies to come to an overall conclusion. Secondary data will originally have been gathered by means of observations, case studies, questionnaires, interviews, and experiments, and will originally have been primary data. However, they become secondary data when used in another study. Evaluation of primary data. Strengths. Primary data is a reliable source because the researcher can replicate the procedures to check results, as they know the procedures and how the data was collected and analyzed. Primary data is also more up to date. Data gathered years previously is less likely to provide reliable answers to the questions your data needs to address. Since primary data is taken directly from the population in question, it is one of the best types of data to collect for research methods like the survey. Weaknesses. Researchers may be subjective in what kinds of data they look for, in particular data that fits the hypothesis they are trying to test. The data has to be gathered from scratch, which involves finding a large enough population to make the sample credible and generalizable, and in turn glean a large amount of data. This usually makes it more costly and time-consuming because the direct and personal intervention than collecting secondary data. Secondary data evaluation. Strengths. It saves some time and expense that would otherwise be spent collecting data. It can provide a larger database than an individual researcher could hope to collect. And in some cases, secondary data is often the only resource and thus the only way to examine large-scale trends of the past. Weaknesses. The researcher cannot personally check the data, so its reliability may be questioned. The researcher may have no knowledge of how the data was collected and have no control over it. Therefore, they do not know anything about its accuracy or its bounds of error. The data may be out of date and therefore not suitable for current research.